our sixth session of Eurasian Online Seminar. It is organized by the Department of International Relations and International Laboratory on World Order Studies and the New Regionalism, which is part of Faculty of World Economy and International Relations at High School of Economics in Moscow. And we are delighted to have here with us today a renowned Singaporean diplomat and scholar, Bilahari Kausikan, who will speak on Southeast Asia after the pandemic. Well, Mr. Kausikan is the chairman of the Middle East Institute, which is an autonomous institute of National University of Singapore at the moment. He was educated at Raffles Institution and the University of Singapore, and Columbia University in New York. And he was Singaporean diplomat since that time. He was permanent secretary of Singapore's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is, I think, the highest position, highest administrative or non-political
civil service, non-political.
Yeah, civil service, yes, non-political position. Before that, he was second permanent secretary, and he was also ambassador at large after that, and before that, deputy secretary for Southeast Asia, permanent representative to the United Nations in New York, and ambassador to the Russian Federation. He has been known in recent years for commenting extensively in Singapore's foreign affairs, in newspapers, public lectures, and social media. He is the author of many articles and several books, including Dealing with an Ambiguous World, which is a collection of his lectures given in 2016, and the book Singapore is Not an Island, published last year. But this is all not very important. The most important thing I should say is that Bilahari is an original thinker on foreign affairs and a great representative of Southeastern intellectual tradition, I would say, which is a very original and a mixture of various influences and cultures, you know, Confucianism, Western culture, Malaya culture, East, West, everything. And it's very important for us to listen to such people, because to have not just a Western perspective or not just a Chinese perspective, but perspectives from other countries. So I'm very happy to have Mr. Kausikan today with us. So the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Lukin. Thank you, Professor Karaganov. I'm glad to see you again, although I can't be with you, unfortunately. I hope this will be a dialogue rather than a monologue by me, but let me make some opening remarks, and then let's have a dialogue, question and answers. First of all, let me make a very general point, which I think may be obvious, but still needs to be made. When you are in the middle of a global crisis, it is not the best time to make cool or clinical geopolitical assessments of any kind. Generally speaking, you are so much caught up reacting to events of today, of this week or this month, that you don't have the right perspective or the right detachment to make balanced judgments. With that qualification, let me nevertheless try to make some judgments. First of all, I think we will have to distinguish the geopolitical effects of the pandemic on Southeast Asia from the geo-economic effects of the pandemic on Southeast Asia. My view, which of course is not shared by people, is that the direct geopolitical impact, and I stress the word direct, may not be very much. And there's been far too much excited commentary that this pandemic will tilt the balance in Southeast Asia against the US, for China, and so on. I think this is not yet warranted by any facts. We don't even know whether we are at the end of the pandemic, are we at the beginning of a new phase, and so on. So it's premature to try to make definitive judgments. That said, why do I think that the direct impact on geopolitics in Southeast Asia will be minimal? Well, I think the issue is very simple. Last week, I gave a conference by the internet to the Council of Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. And they asked me, who's winning, China or the US? How are Southeast Asians looking at the pandemic? And I said, the very fact you asked this question, do we tilt towards the Chinese or do we tilt towards the Americans, betrays the fact that you think all of us in Southeast Asia are either terribly stupid or so corrupt as to believe anything and everything that either the Chinese or you, the Americans, tell us. We may look stupid, but we have our own thoughts, And Southeast Asians tend to be quite reserved about sharing their thoughts. And we have an unfortunate tendency, perhaps, to agree with whoever we are talking to at a particular moment in order to see what benefits we can extract. That's part of the culture of the region. But actually, I think, as far as I can determine, the attitudes of Southeast Asian elites, I'm not talking about the public as a whole, is not binary. It's not that we believe China and not the US, or we believe the US and not China. In fact, I think there are three main strands. I think, first of all, among the elites, there is an understanding, we may not talk about it very much, that for whatever reason the Chinese did for the crucial first 5 days, either denied the seriousness of this new disease or tried to cover it up. And this allowed the disease to take hold and spread beyond China's borders. And so to that extent, they must bear responsibility. However, secondly, I think it is also recognized that once they realized that they had made this mistake, they moved decisively and indeed even ruthlessly to contain the disease. In fact, if you look at what they did, in effect, they seemed to be prepared to write off Wuhan and maybe Hubei province. They gave them what they could and basically said, indeed, if not in word, you will take care of yourself. And by acting so decisively and ruthlessness, they managed to contain the disease in a relatively short period of time. And this is an achievement that is, I think, acknowledged by Southeast Asian elites, if not admired. But thirdly, I think there is also understanding that only China could have acted in this way. No other country, no other political system could act in this way. Not even Vietnam, which has a broadly similar system to China. And therefore, what the Chinese did was sui generis. It cannot be compared to what the Western countries or America specifically did or did not do. So that's basically why, because of the complexity of these attitudes, I don't think the direct impact will be very great. Those inclined, at the end of the pandemic, and it will end sooner or later, at the end of the pandemic, the Chinese will still be a big, important, influential player in Southeast Asia. But so will America still be a big, important, influential player in Southeast Asia. And so will Japan, and so will India, and so will Australia, and so will South Korea, and so on. In effect, actually, if you look at surveys, and the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore has done surveys over 2 or 3 years, asking more or less the same questions, and the results are very, very consistent. If you ask the question, is China influential and will it grow more influential? Among Southeast Asian elites, the answer is an overwhelming yes. But if you ask, do you trust China? Will China do the right thing? The answer among Southeast Asian elites is overwhelmingly no. I don't trust China. And you get much the same pattern when you ask these questions about the United States. Is the United States important? Overwhelmingly yes. Do you trust the United States? Overwhelmingly no. And I think neither the US nor China will come out from this pandemic looking brilliant. Both for different reasons. Initially, different but broadly similar reasons, in fact, reasons of domestic politics, initially downplayed the seriousness of the disease. And this made the economic costs of dealing with the pandemic, the global economic costs, of the much higher, probably, than it absolutely needed to be. But although they ran up the bill, it's all of us, the rest of us, are going to have to pay in one way or the other. And this is not something that builds great trust in either the United States or China. So I don't think it will fundamentally change the trajectories, directly change the trajectory in geopolitics. Now, at the same time, I think you have to bear in mind that Southeast Asia is the crossroads and has been since time immemorial of major powers, and therefore the crossroads of many major powers because of its strategic position. And the fact that you acknowledge that both the US and China are going to be important, but at the same time don't trust either very much, will enhance the natural multipolarity of this region. In other words, nobody is going to put all their eggs in either the American basket or the Chinese basket. They are going to keep their options open. They will try to have as good a relationship as they can with all the major powers and all the regional powers, including Russia. In fact, we would like Russia to be a little more active in your own national interest in our region. Because multipolarity gives small countries agency. It gives us room to maneuver. Now, let me go on to the economics. I think the economics will have a significant impact. Although we cannot at present tell the extent of the impact or how significant it will be, but that it will have an impact is no doubt. Even before this pandemic began, there was a certain rethinking and some movement of supply chains out of China. At that time, mainly because of the US-China trade tensions. And certainly, one thing the pandemic has done is to expose to businesses their over-reliance on supply chains that converge on China. I happened to be, my last trip before we could not travel was in late February and early March to Germany, and it was to Berlin. It was quite interesting to me because I had a chance. My background is in diplomacy, so I normally talk to foreign ministry types or scholars of international relations. But this time I had a chance to talk to corporate types. And they told me, yes, they think they are not going to abandon the Chinese market. They're not going to abandon production in China, but they will have to think hard about over-reliance for their supplies from China. Now, this can have, so I'm sure some reorientation of supply chains will occur. It already was occurring before the pandemic, and more will occur. But what I cannot say at time now is the extent to which companies will reorientate supply chains out of China. You must have read that Prime Minister Abe's government in Japan has set aside some funds to help Japanese firms that want to move production out of China back to Japan. And in fact, Japan has, for maybe 15 years or more, been trying to pursue a China plus one strategy. That means they will still produce in China, but they don't want to be over-reliant, and they want to produce, they'll find another country in which to distribute their production chain. But the fact is, the hard fact is, over about 15 years of pursuing this strategy, they haven't been able to find a suitable plus one to China. They do a bit in Vietnam, it's not really a replacement. They do a bit in Indonesia, in Thailand, in India, it's not really a replacement. So I think it remains to be seen how much the supply chains are going to be reoriented. Much will depend on how quickly the Chinese economy recovers. It took a huge hit, that's obvious, but to the extent that I think it was yesterday, the Chinese announced that for the first time, they're not going to put a number to their GDP growth target, which is probably quite wise. I think Mr. Xi Jinping is finding out, and the entire Chinese apparatus is finding out, that it's much easier to command a stop to production than to order a resumption of production. They have put aside quite a lot of money, I forgot the figure right now, to deal with the economic consequences of the pandemic. But it's not working, apparently, as far as we can see, as well as they had hoped to be. And they have had to be far more cautious than in stimulating the economy than what they did in 2008, 2009 during the global financial crisis. Because they were already having to deal with structural weaknesses like a huge mountain of debt, and they know it's a problem. They don't want to compound it too much. At the same time, they are very worried about social stability, or the social stability implications of a slowing economy. From what I can see, the various the pandemic stimulus measures have worked quite well with the big Chinese corporations like Huawei, Tencent, Alibaba, and so on. They have recovered production and so on quite well. However, the small and medium-sized industries, which are something like 80% of the, account for something like 80% of China's GDP, have not recovered very quickly. And they are still in some trouble. And the small and medium-sized industries are far more important for social stability, which is the leadership's main concern. Now, how will this affect Southeast Asia and ASEAN? Some of my ASEAN colleagues that I have spoke to remotely, even before the pandemic, were quite optimistic that Southeast Asia can benefit if supply chains are diverted. And some were already diverted to Vietnam in particular. But I take a more cautious approach. Even in Vietnam, they did benefit. Some Chinese moved to Vietnam, some Japanese, some other countries moved to Vietnam, but they were already running into constraints of inadequate infrastructure, constraints of inadequate supply of skilled labor with the right skills to take full advantage, and there was a certain constraint. So whether or not the Southeast Asian countries can benefit will depend on their ability to adapt their own national policies to do what is needed to be done to make themselves a more attractive investment destination. And this is not to be taken for granted, because quite a number of Southeast Asian countries are preoccupied with their internal politics, which makes it difficult to change direction or do what they know needs to be done. Secondly, it is not automatic that if there is diversion of supply chains, it must come to Southeast Asia. Why should it? During the 2016 election campaign, Mr. Trump talked about bringing American business back home to the US, and people laughed at him. Now, with developments in what has been called, technological developments in what has been called the fourth industrial revolution, it doesn't seem to be such a stupid idea after all, because the new kinds of artificial intelligence driven robotics, things like 3D printing, they are, I think, eroding the cost advantages of widely distributing your supply chains in some industries, maybe not all industries, but some industries. We are still at the beginning of the fourth industrial revolution, and we don't know how these new technologies will ultimately play out. But in theory, at least, you can bring some industries back home. And this has profound implications, especially for Southeast Asia, but particularly for the less developed Southeast Asian countries. Look, how did all of us, first Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and then Malaysia, Thailand, how do we develop our economies? We develop our economies by moving up the value chain. And the value chain is closely correlated with the supply chain. And if the supply chain disappears entirely, what are the Laos, the Myanmars, the Cambodias, the Indonesias, the Philippines going to do? They may get stuck, not even in the middle income trap, at some lower point of the development ladder. And this has really serious long-term implications for ASEAN. If they cannot develop, if they get trapped, it will foster even greater inequalities between ASEAN countries and give a sharper edge to the diversity of the region. Now, beyond supply chains, almost the whole world has been in an unprecedented situation or lockdown for several months. And this has also profound implications for the future of work. For example, Singapore, we discovered, to our surprise, over the last couple of months, when we have told people to stay at home and not go to the office, only a few essential people can go to the office. We have found, to our surprise, that actually something like 70% of the jobs can be done from home. Now think about that. That has huge implications. Companies will say, if most of my employees can work from home, why do I need a lot of office space? Why do I need all this big and fancy office space? That has implications for the real estate market, which is important in all the ASEAN countries, and can have a serious multiplier effect. We in Singapore think, because we are a little bit more advanced in the digitalization of our systems, we can possibly benefit. But some other ASEAN countries, if this revolution in work takes place, and coupled with a change in investment patterns because of reorientation of supply chains, they may be in trouble. One final point. ASEAN as an organization did not perform very well during this pandemic. In fact, no regional organization, beginning with the EU, performed very well. Vietnam was the chair, which was fortunate because it's a very competent chair, and it did keep the regular mechanism of ASEAN running through video conferencing, something like we are doing, or conference calls and so on. So the mechanism did not stop. But we didn't really respond to the pandemic in a very organized way. We did help each other, but on the basis of bilateral assistance to other countries. For example, we gave ventilators and test kits and so on to other ASEAN countries. But the fact that Vietnam kept the system running is important, because the essential purpose of ASEAN, don't forget, is actually to manage relationships between its own members. And that was important in a time of crisis, because, for example, we in Singapore were afraid of getting overwhelmed by Indonesians coming to Singapore to seek medical treatment, the more wealthy ones. And there were some that came and brought the infection with them. So we put severe restrictions on Indonesians coming to Singapore. And basically all our hospitals and private doctors, including private doctors, were told you only treat Singapore citizens and Singapore permanent residents. Malaysia stopped workers coming to Singapore. And we are quite dependent on Malaysian labor in our economy. And there were other examples of ASEAN countries having these kinds of restrictions against each other as a response to the pandemic. And it could have caused bilateral problems, but it did. And it did not for one reason, that the basic mechanisms of ASEAN, which are meant to manage these kinds of bilateral issues, kept running. But that said, I think going forward, and again, last week I gave an interview over video, by video conference to Vietnam, a television station in Vietnam. And they told me what should Vietnam do for the remaining part of its chairmanship. I think it is planning to do so, or several ASEAN countries are planning to do so. We should start a serious conversation on what we can do the next time a pandemic hits our region, because there will be a next time, for sure. 100% it will happen. We just don't know when, we just don't know what would be the particular disease, but it will happen, and we should try to be more organized as a region. We in Singapore and some other ASEAN countries, and some other countries in East Asia, it sounds peculiar to say this, did benefit because we suffered from SARS 17 years ago. So, and at that time, I was still in government, and I can tell you, we were trying to make it up as events unfolded, because this was unprecedented. But having had that experience 17 years ago, we put into place the infrastructure, the legal regulatory frameworks to deal with this, and so we didn't do too badly. The number of infections in Singapore is high, is a bit over 20,000. But that is a very deceptive figure, because about most of it, I think about 17,000 of it, are foreign workers living in dormitories. And of the total of 20,198 to be precise, as of yesterday, over 17,000 are not in hospital, but they are in isolation. Mostly they are the foreign workers. When I say they are in isolation, means that although they have tested positive for the virus, they are actually clinically well, or their symptoms are so mild that you don't need a lot of medical intervention. We just monitor them medically, and they will recover by themselves. In fact, we only have about 1,400, slightly over 1,400 in hospital, but they are all in stable condition. Only 23 are in critical condition in the ICU, and we have only had 20 deaths. And that's because we were prepared. Same for South Korea, same for Taiwan, same for Hong Kong, because of the previous experience. Now, for ASEAN as a whole, we should begin thinking about how we can prepare as a region to do better next time. I'll stop here now, and I hope to take your questions.
Thank you very much. Yes, Professor Karaganov, do you want to make some comments? Oh, your microphone is switched off again. Could you switch on his?
One second, please, because something happened to my mic.
No, it's okay. It's okay now.
We can hear you.
We can hear you.
You can hear.
Yes, it's okay.
Something has happened. Oh, first of all, I mean, thank you very much, Bilahari. I mean, this is an excellent expose, and a really fresh one. But you are close to one of the countries on which we have an extremely mixed picture, and that is India. India is one of the biggest and potentially most influential players in the world. We know something how things are happening there, but we could not understand from the mixed signals what actually is happening there and where India goes in terms of course, virus, but also how this new situation influences, if at all, the debate within India. We have had an excellent expose by Professor Tapran. I mean, and he gave us one view, but Singaporeans, and especially you, of course, but I remember, of course, Minister Mentor, are known to be the best specialists on India, not only on China. What is your view of where things are going in India?
Well, I don't know very much more than what you know, right? Because India, first of all, is such a vast country. In fact, it's not one country, it's many countries in one country. Population over 1 billion. It has a state and central government system. It's very complicated. At least I can say that Mr. Modi acted decisively after some initial delay, like everybody else, to lock down the major population centers to check the spread of the disease. But I don't think it's going to be easy, even for the Indian government, let alone outsiders like us, to get a handle on the extent of the problem in India, because it's such a vast country. It's such a vast country. It has, and it's a very diverse country. Some parts, the medical infrastructure is very developed. Some parts, it's not so developed, and most of India is rural. But I would say that they are doing, given these constraints, the best they can. Like everybody else, the Indians have to balance health considerations against economic considerations. Everybody has to do this. But don't forget that India is still very largely a rural and poor country. And you know, in Singapore, if we get the balance between health and economics wrong, well, people will lose their jobs. People are going to lose their jobs anyway. But we are a small place, compact place. You can help these people. In India, if people lose their jobs, there are lots of migrant workers. I can't remember the figure, but it's a huge figure of migrant workers from one part of India to the other. They have gone home. If they have no work, they may starve. So it's a very difficult problem for India. We should be patient with them, and we should be sympathetic with them. But I think they are generally, given all the constraints, moving in the right direction.
But may I continue, Professor Lukin?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
My question was exactly about the second part of your, I mean, countries like India and some other relatively poor countries in Asia, and especially in the larger Middle East, will face hunger, obviously, if things go like they go.
Well, you know,
for social structures, because they have been, I mean, with ups and downs, but they have been growingly stable. But under circumstances, aren't you afraid that they will have, I mean, all kind of mutinies, rebellions, not only India, but Pakistan and countries nearby?
Yeah, it is a worry. I mean, in fact, if you put it in that framework of some of the Middle Eastern countries, some of the other Southeast Asian countries, and indeed some of the Southeast Asian countries, India is not in a bad position by comparison. It's in a difficult position, but by comparison to some of the countries in the Middle East, let's say Iran, let's say Iraq, in Southeast Asia, look at Myanmar, look at Indonesia, 260 million people, 17,000 islands. How can they contact trace? How can they test? Right? And now it's Ramadan. Jokowi tried to stop people going back to their village. You know, it's the custom during Ramadan, they go back to their village. But if they stay in Jakarta or the big population centers with no work, how are they going to eat? It's a huge dilemma. And it can lead to social instability. In fact, I'm least worried about social instability in India compared to some of the Middle East countries and some of the Southeast Asian countries. There is a real problem. So far, thankfully, there has been no social instability. There have been some minor riots in some of the Gulf states, but this is mainly among foreign workers who basically have been abandoned by some employers. No pay, no food even. And they have, understandably, in some cases, rioted. But that's a relatively small problem because, you know, these are small countries like Singapore. You can get a handle on this if you try. But big countries, Pakistan's cohesion, even under normal circumstances, isn't so great, you know. Normal circumstances. We don't know what is happening in Pakistan. I don't think the Pakistan government knows either. We don't really have the full picture of what's happening in Indonesia. For the longest time, you remember, Indonesia did not report any infections. Nobody believed that. And the Indonesian government was honest enough to say, we just can't test, so we don't know. So we are far from at the end of the problems. Maybe they won't erupt as badly as you and I worry about, Sergey, but we can't discount that possibility.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Because we're talking about India, we have several Indian participants, and General Banerjee wanted to ask a question. Maybe he can also make some comment. So
you could tell us maybe better what's happening.
Yes, of course. Yes, it's a pleasure to respond to this. And Ambassador Kausikan, what a wonderful narration of the issues that you have raised. And I'd like to ask you a question, but just a very quick response regarding India in particular. I think, yes, India is in a very critical situation. I think if you were to assess overall, India's response to this coronavirus and the pandemic has been a very constructive and a measured one. At one level, India has an enormous amount of expertise. If you were to look at the numerous television programs in the West on the coronavirus, about half the experts perhaps are of Indian origin. At the same time, we have got enormous state deficiencies in dealing with such a huge pandemic. But yet, if one were to examine the figures objectively, and there's no reason to doubt the accuracy of the figures, even though I would concede that the testing is much less widespread in India, and therefore some of the data may not be captured. But yet, I think we have a very strong system of governance in position with a leader who is accepted in the entire country, who has taken and given firm directions regarding the steps to be taken to counter this pandemic. The choice is not really between lives or livelihood. For countries such as India, and for most countries in the world, there is no clear-cut choice between the two. Each have to be handled in the best possible way in order to bring about the best possible solution. I think the steps and measures that India has taken have been fairly sound, and there has been no widespread resistance, obstacles, or challenges to the decisions of the state. Yes, we are currently in the process of stemming the spread of this coronavirus, and the challenge will really be in restarting the economy in a meaningful way. I think here again, another lesson I think from the Indian experience is the Indian effort at getting its own diaspora back from around the world. Right now in India, we are undertaking a major exercise in getting the Indian diaspora from all the countries from the US to UK, to the Gulf countries, and from the rest of the world back to India. A massive exercise being undertaken by the Navy, by the Air Force, and the civil airlines, etc. And I think overall, the scale of the difficulties in India appears to be much less in terms of the medical response to the problem. But I think the challenge to the economic revival of the Indian economy, which was already under some stress just before the pandemic broke, will be a major challenge. Here again, I think we are quite deliberate in trying to open up the economy in a steady manner, not getting too hurried about it, but taking one step at a time. The problems are enormous, and we have to be absolutely on our toes. Now, if I can request Ambassador Kausikan for some comments. Sure. Now, Ambassador Kausikan, I think if one were to look at the pandemics, there could be two ways to view the outcome or the aftermath of the pandemic. One, that this is compared to a major global conflict, war, and hence, at the end of it, the changes that will be brought about within global geopolitics, economics, social interactions, supply chains, etc., will undergo a very significant, dramatic, revolutionary changeover. The other view is that, no, even though the impact may be severe, but the changes need not be very radical. What might be your views? Especially, I think, in the context, the problem is going to be posed in the manner that each state has dealt with this issue. Whereas we've seen the confusion in Europe, and of course, I think in the United States of America, but in all of East Asia and Southeast Asia, the governments have played their cards extremely well and have dealt with the problem effectively, cleanly, at the earliest, and hence perhaps at the end of this pandemic will perhaps be better off to shape the global dispensation and the global order. May I have your views on this? And perhaps can I request you for your views on measures that we would need to take, especially in this entire region, to counter the after effects of the pandemic?
Well, first of all, I agree with what you said about India. It's got a lot of problems, but relative to those problems, it's handled this quite well. Now, you said there were two possibilities about the effect on global order. One, there will be a radical change. Second, there will be not so much radical change. I actually tend to the latter view, the second view. Why do I say that? First, I gave you some reasons in my presentations. I don't think the major powers, US and China, which are in a different tier from the other regional powers, neither of them will come out of this looking very brilliant. Secondly, yes, the so-called liberal international order was under stress, but I think we should not exaggerate that. First of all, some people, not just in the West, some people in Asia too, talk as if the liberal international order is the natural order of things. It is not the natural order of things. The period when the liberal international order seemed to be the natural order of things was a very short one, maybe from 1989 to 2008, 2009, when the global financial crisis broke out. For most of the 20th century, the international order has been divided. And we may be going back to a divided international order. I don't think the divisions are going to be as stark as during the Cold War, but it's not as if the American-led global international order is the natural order of things. Yes, I think by and large, generally speaking, the Asian countries have done better, but that does not mean that they automatically will be able to exercise decisive leadership in the in the shaping or in the future evolution of the divided international order? I think it's far too early to say, because Asia is a very big place. I remember, and it's been written about several times, in 1988, Mr. Deng Xiaoping told Mr. Rajiv Gandhi that he did not believe in this idea that the next century will be the century of the Asia Pacific, because it could not be unless India and China were both developed. And I would add, unless India, China, Japan, South Korea can have the same goals, and that is not to be taken for granted. And don't forget, the Pacific has two shores. Huh? It's not as if the United States is going to disappear, you know, after this. So I think it's far too early to say that Asia can play a decisive, that it will play a role. Of course it will play a role. Countries like India, China, Japan are big countries. They're strong countries. They will play some role, but whether they will play a decisive role, I am not so sure. One thing that we need to think seriously about is the role of international organizations and multilateral institutions in handling these kinds of crises. The WTO did come in for a lot of criticism from Mr. Trump in particular and the US. Some of it may be partially at least justified. For example, the WTO advised people early on not to cancel flights to China. Singapore went ahead and canceled the flights anyway. And I think it was the right thing to do. But after that, they have behaved quite well, given the constraints that all international organizations face. No international organization can do more than what its principal members allow it to do. We have to think, I think, seriously, not just in the case of the WHO, but in the case of some of the more technical international organizations, how to insulate them as much as possible from politicization. Because I see in my career, in some of the more technical international organizations, WHO is one of them, ICAO, International Civil Aviation is one of them, another of them, IMO is another of them. There has been, in the 37 years or so when I was in the Foreign Service, a steady politicization of these institutions, which were at one time, even the IPU, one time just much more technical. I think you can't hold any particular country or any particular great power culpable for this. All of them have to share some responsibility, but that's a serious problem. We need to keep the technical agencies technical. You can't 100% insulate them from politics, because that's the nature of the political system, the international system. But we have to think seriously how, in our common interest, we should insulate them as much as possible.
Right. So well, thank you for your answers. Professor Kanaev, who is our expert on the region, wanted to make a comment.
Can you hear me well?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
Yes,
First,
yes.
Dr. Kausikan, first of all, let me express my heartfelt gratitude for you, to you for your very insightful presentation. And I have a very specific question that relates to the present-day ASEAN policy. It seems to me that ASEAN is in a triple trap. First, connectivity. Do not you really suppose that this narrative is very seriously undermined, and in the present circumstances we cannot speak seriously about connectivity as something that is really workable and efficient? And the coronavirus pandemic is responsible for this dismal state of things. Second, institutions. They were stumbling even before the present day pandemic, for example, as the different difference between goods and services began to be blurred in the conditions of the fourth industrial revolution, ASEAN had to completely revise its projects of economic regionalism, and I cannot say that the association has been able to do it successfully. And second, the digital part of business cooperation. It seems to me that business cannot be relied upon as an actor that can change the situation for the better because of many factors, and the key factor is very simple. In the ASEAN states, business has been unable to resolve humanitarian issues from the commercial point of view. In these circumstances, it is China that can really and efficiently resolve problems. We may criticize China as much as we want, but we cannot deny an obvious fact. China is ready to give the ASEAN states money, while the United States is experiencing a severe shortage of its budget deficit, and it cannot be relied upon as an actor that can shoulder the ASEAN states in coping with economic grievances. And in the specific circumstances, I would respectfully disagree with you in your assessment that the geopolitical shifts might be only minor or insignificant. In my opinion, China has ample chances to increase its influence in Southeast Asia, and China will not lose this possibility. Thank you so much.
Well, China, you have made 3 points.
Connected question with that about TPP, the Singapore.
Yeah, okay. Can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Now I can hear you. You
Yes.
said something about
Yes.
TPP and I lost you.
Yes, there's a connected question about your view on the future of the TPP.
Okay. First, on institutions and the long-term viability of ASEAN's economic project, which is to make ASEAN the ASEAN region a common production platform. Yes, there are serious questions about that future, given the possible implications of the fourth industrial revolution. I talked a bit about it in my initial remarks. We have to rethink that, but the reality is, I think we are not going to do very serious rethinking because several ASEAN countries are in the midst of political changes, which are not just the normal routine political changes, but may be of a systemic nature. Malaysia is one. Thailand is in a state of suspended political conflict, I would say. They haven't solved their problems. They have suppressed it for a while. I don't think Indonesia has reached a stable state of post-Suharto equilibrium, political equilibrium. Myanmar's future direction, God only knows, and maybe even God doesn't know. All right. So this is not a good time to make new bold decisions. And the reality is, although we should, we are not going to. We are not going to retreat, but we are not going to fundamentally rethink. The same applies to the digital economy. Now on China, I think we have to agree to disagree. First of all, I don't think we disagree that much. Huh? China, as I said, will always be, by reason of its size, by reason of its contiguity, a significant economic and political player in Southeast Asia. But it does not mean that it would ever be the dominant player in Southeast Asia. Why? First, China is, as I told you, acknowledged to be influential, but not particularly trusted among elites. Money can't buy you everything. Nobody is going to shun Chinese money. But people, even before the pandemic, have become more cautious, renegotiating contracts, canceling some, scaling down some projects about China. And I don't think the pandemic is going to change their attitude. It's a kind of contradictory attitude. Nobody's going to shun Chinese money. Nobody's going to shun Chinese investment. That would be stupid, right? But people were already getting a little more cautious. Secondly, I think China has made one very serious mistake in Southeast Asia under the present leadership. The present leadership, you know, I think you know that, at least Alexander must know, that in 1955, the People's Republic of China made a very wise decision to, as much as possible, separate the Huaren from the Huaqiao. Huaren are ethnic Chinese, overseas Chinese ethnic, right? Not of PRC nationality. Huaqiao are of the PRC citizenship. They separated these two concepts. Under Mr. Xi Jinping, and many of his speeches have demanded the support of all Chinese for his China dream. These two concepts have been merged. This is very dangerous in Southeast Asia because the position of the overseas Chinese has always and will always remain a very delicate one. I don't know why they have done this. Organizationally, they have done something which I consider, and I've told my Chinese friends, incredibly stupid and not in China's interest. They have put the Overseas Chinese Affairs Office, which was a state function, under the direct control of the United Front Work Department, which is a party function. This is incredibly stupid. Why they did it, I don't know. It just raises all kinds of suspicions. And in Southeast Asia, in particular, Indonesia and Malaysia, but to some degree in Myanmar and some other countries, race is a factor. It will always be a factor. And there is this undercurrent that is a limiting measure. A related problem is Xinjiang and the effort to synthesize Islam in Southeast Asia. Now, nobody makes a fuss about it, particularly, and don't forget, Southeast Asia is essentially a Muslim region, right? Or at least the Muslims are the most numerous in this region. Now, nobody makes a fuss about it, but it doesn't mean people are not aware about it. So there is at least that other mental reservation. So I don't think the future is all that rosy as you made out for China. There are obstacles, there are impediments. As I said, nobody is going to shun China. That would be really stupid, and you can't. It's contiguous to your region. But everybody is going to be a little bit cautious. Everybody is going to hedge and balance simultaneously. And that is what I mean by enhancing the natural multipolarity of Southeast Asia.
Right. Thank you. The next one is Sergei Trush, who is an expert on US-China relations. Sergei, do you hear me?
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yep.
Yes, yes.
Thank you, Professor Kausikan, for your presentation. Let me ask you a question that is a little bit broader than the scope of your topic, but you partially started to reflect on this idea already. We have yesterday in this very seminar, we have quite an interesting talk and discussion on the soft power of China. And the speaker was Bates Gill, probably you know the name, the former Stockholm Institute director. Well, and one of the conclusions or just topics that aroused during this discussion was that Chinese working with its soft power not very effective in generally speaking, first because it's not quite connected or harmonized with the probably pro-Western system of beliefs that it's being oriented on. So the understanding of soft power in the West and in China is pretty different. And the second idea was that soft power of China is not working quite effectively because it's not soft power of the Chinese culture, Chinese civilization history, but it is the soft power of PP. just the instrumental for direct diplomatic outcome. Let me ask you how you feel the Chinese soft power efficiency in Southeast Asia, since Southeast Asia is pretty synthetic place where the Western soft power and the Chinese soft power is in a sort of competition. How you feel this, and to what extent do you think this Chinese soft power will be more effective or less effective under the certain circumstances with this pandemic? Thank you.
Before I answer your question, I forgot to answer the question of TPP. Yeah? So let me just make a few brief remarks on that. The TPP in its original form was not a traditional free trade agreement. The TPP was meant to set standards for the next generation of industries. And the main beneficiary of the TPP as the setter of standards for the next generation of industries would actually have been the United States. And I at least think, and I think the Japanese think so too, that's why they kept it alive, TPP minus US, that one day, I don't know when, please don't ask me, they will come to their senses and re-engage. We may have to change the name, but they will re-engage. Now, about soft power in Southeast Asia. I must tell you, first of all, that I do not believe that you can have soft power if you don't have hard power, right? Soft power supplements hard power. It cannot substitute for hard power. And the biggest example of that is very close to Russian borders. The EU thinks it can be a new kind of great power, soft power, rather than hard power. That's rubbish, okay? And they won't admit it, but you can see it. That's why they don't really have a strategy for anything. And nobody really takes them seriously outside the economic field. Not in Asia anyway. So I don't believe you can have hard power, soft power without having hard power. Secondly, I think China is attractive, not in the way of soft power, but in the way because you cannot ignore China. It's a big, important country. Whether you like it, you don't like it, that's actually irrelevant. You have to deal with it. Like you may like the US or dislike the US, you still have to deal with it. You may like Japan or you may dislike Japan, you still have to deal with it. You may like India, you may dislike India, you still have to deal with it. Big powers cannot be ignored. So this concept of soft power, hard power is in fact, in some degree, irrelevant. Secondly, I think, as I said, there are certain liabilities in Chinese diplomacy. I've mentioned some of them in my answer to the previous question. And some question marks in the minds of many Muslims in Southeast Asia, although they don't sort of publicly articulate it too much, they have a bit, but about what's happening in Xinjiang and to Hui Muslims in China. Some question marks in places like Malaysia and Indonesia in particular, but also Myanmar. But what about the over-engagement, I would say, maybe that's the right word, of overseas Chinese? I mentioned the merging, or the subordination of the Overseas Chinese Affairs Office to the United Front Work Office, and that is really raising all kinds of suspicions. But most of all, I think sometimes there is a certain cultural altruism in Chinese diplomacy. There is a certain lack of sensitivity, I think mainly because Chinese diplomats have a very difficult time. They have to talk simultaneously to two audiences. They have to please two audiences simultaneously. One, they have to deal with whatever country they are dealing with, right? But simultaneously, they have to deal with at home. To some degree, that is true of all diplomats. I always told my young officers that diplomacy begins at home, and it's often more difficult to convince your own government than to convince some foreign government of what to do. But that is even more acute in China. Right? You look at the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, right? It's not in Chinese interest, but it's clearly meant to please the Chinese leadership. So Chinese diplomats are often in a very difficult position. You must have seen what Cui Tengkai, who is a diplomat I deeply respect, for a very short period, he was like my counterpart on the Chinese side dealing with ASEAN. And he's a brilliant diplomat in any country. You'll be a brilliant diplomat in Singapore, in Russia, everywhere, right? He just happens to be a Chinese diplomat. But clearly, his attitude towards these conspiracy theories, he does not think it's helpful to China. There is some division in the Chinese foreign ministry about how to sell the Chinese story most effectively. You see, in some European countries, Chinese diplomats behaving in what I would consider a rather peculiar manner. But it's not illogical if you bear in mind that their main audience is at home. It is not the host country. So, but all that said, I come back to my first point. I don't believe you can have soft power without hard power. And if you are a big country like China or the United States or Russia or India or Japan, other countries will have to deal with you. Whether they love you or not is not relevant.
But the United States and China do have hard powers in Southeast Asia. So
yeah, so we will have to deal with both. We'll have to deal with both. I mean, one of the lines the Chinese diplomats and others use is that the US is unreliable. Yeah, the US is unreliable. It's always been unreliable. Every 4 years, you have to re-educate the US about what's happening in our region. You have to talk to them again and tell them again and again what's happening, because every 4 years, they even if the same party or the same president comes back to power, there's a certain, their memory only lasts 4 years. So this has always been the case. But can you, for that reason, stop dealing with the United States? Of course not. We can't stop dealing with the United States. We can't stop dealing with China. We'll have to deal with them the best they can. Both of them are strong. Both of them have weaknesses. We'll just have to accept it. I always used to tell young Singapore Foreign Service officers, big countries are like the weather, the climate. You can't change the weather. But if you think it's going to rain, please buy an umbrella and carry it with you. You have to adapt yourself to them. That's all.
Okay, that's a great comparison. Thank you very much. And the next one is Andrei Dikharov. Dr. Dikharov is an expert on China. Are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, go ahead, please.
Yes. Mr. Kausikan, first of all, thank you for your narration. I have a very short question about this notorious problem of land features within U-shaped line in the South China Sea.
Okay.
Do you expect in the nearest future any changes in this stance of China or in the stance of ASEAN probably and its members?
No, I don't think there's going to be any change in any direction for the foreseeable future.
Yes.
I think at a strategic level, the situation in the South China Sea is more or less a strategic stalemate.
I see.
In other words, nobody is going to make the Chinese dig up those artificial islands and throw the sand back in the sea. They won't do it. And sooner or later, they will deploy military assets there. But at the same time, they cannot deter the US and its allies from operating in the South China Sea, through the South China Sea, over the South China Sea, without risking war, and I don't think anybody wants war. So it's more or less a stalemate. And in fact, it's becoming ritualized. The former Soviet Union and the US used to play these games during the Cold War. But after some time, both of you found ways to make them as less dangerous as possible. And I can see that happening in the South China Sea. Actually, dangerous incidents, they get a lot of publicity, but they are fairly rare. And about 3 years ago, maybe, then commander of PATCOM, Admiral Harry Harris, he's retired since, did admit in public in Singapore at the Shangri-La Dialogue that actually dangerous incidents are rare, and actually both sides are more or less adhering to unspoken codes for unplanned encounters at sea. So I think, and then, you know, nobody's going to give up claims. Nobody ever gives up claims.
So
you may not pursue them. What?
So you do not foresee any substantial developments in this respect?
You can always, there is always a possibility of accidents, right? But I think the possibility of a deliberate conflict is very, very low. It has to be not a practical proposition. Secondly, I am sure in time, the Chinese will deploy military assets on a permanent basis, at least to some of those islands or islets, probably in the pericels rather than the Spratleys, but they will do it. But I don't think that will itself deter the Seventh Fleet and its allies. Japan is taking a more active role from operating in the South China Sea. They can't unless you're prepared to risk war, and I don't think anybody wants a war. I don't think war is inevitable. I think theories like that by Mr. Allison, Professor Allison, the Thucydides trap, they are just silly. They're just too mechanical. So I think the situation will continue as it is. The situation is as it is. The status quo is the best it gets. It's not ideal, but then this is not an ideal world, you know.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Mr. Anton Tsvetov wanted to ask.
Oh, Anton, he's here?
Yes, he is here, I think.
Yes,
Are you here?
Thank you, Professor Lukin. Bilahari, really good to see you.
How are you?
I'm great. It's really good to see you here, and a great opportunity to ask you a question. I think I would like you to pick up a little bit on what you said about the COVID crisis impact on Southeast Asian countries' economies. One important trend that a lot of us are not looking forward to, but anticipating, is the diversification of value chains and maybe even reshoring, meaning the shift of production closer to the consumer and further from the producers, some of which are in the Southeast Asian region. So if this trend is really realized and we see more and more of that, how do you expect some key Southeast Asian economies to react? So would that mean, for example, a greater emphasis on domestic consumption, or at least intra-ASEAN consumption? Could that lead to more a construction of intra-ASEAN, or at least intra-ASEAN +3 value chains? How would you expect the economies to react? Thank you for that.
Well, I think there will be some reshoring, there will be some reorientation of value chains, as I said in my opening remarks. What I cannot tell right now is the extent to which this will occur. The immediate problem for all the ASEAN countries is that I think the world is in a recession, and we will all go into recession. It's a matter of degrees, that's all. Singapore will be badly affected. In fact, all of us will be affected to different degrees. But we are fortunate in Singapore that we have enough ammunition to see this out. In other words, we have enough reserves. We have already announced 3 budgets since February to extend the amount of support we give to businesses and people who have lost their jobs and so on. So I think we can handle it. We can hold the line until things get better. That may not be the case for bigger countries or less developed countries with smaller reserves. And that is, as I think we discussed with Professor Karaganov, a possibility of social unrest, political instability, which we have to always bear in mind. But the long-term problem, I come back to this. If there is substantial reshoring, if value chains are diversified out of the immediate region, some of the ASEAN countries can get stuck somewhere up the development ladder. And that can sharpen relations between ASEAN members. I don't think the ASEAN +3 can completely make up for this, because the same concerns Americans and Europeans have about over-reliance on supply chains that converge in China exist in Japan and in Korea too, South Korea. So I think that is not a solution. Besides, the relations between the +3 are not problem-free. Right? They managed to have the occasional meeting, that's good. Atmosphere is somewhat improved because everybody got other things to worry about rather than quarrel with them among themselves. But you know, it's not a solution. So I think there is great uncertainty, and this uncertainty can have geopolitical consequences, although I think the direct geopolitical consequences will not be so great. Look, my big worry now, I mean, I'm resigned. I think we are all resigned to the fact that the world economy is going to be in a recession. I just hope a recession doesn't become a depression. What is the difference between a recession and a depression? Well, a depression is more prolonged for a start, but most important, a depression has geopolitical consequences. And I see both the US and China in no way mitigating their strategic competition merely because of the pandemic or because the world economy is in recession. They have other considerations. And that's not very healthy for anybody.
Okay. We have two more questions, I think.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
No, there's a third one.
Okay.
3 more questions, and that's it. So
okay.
The next is Anastasia Petashkova, another expert from China. Go ahead, please.
Hello, Professor. Thank you so much for your insightful lecture and the comments on the questions. I'd like to continue the topic of unhealthy confrontation as you saw in the situation that is going on with China and the US. And I also noticed that in April, there were several publications in Reuters, Japan Times, and Foreign Policy and other sources about Mekong River, and China was blamed on basically causing the drought in 2019, which is the worst drought in 100 years. And as we know, the situation is with food security due to the pandemic is also very very stressful, and many countries who exported food actually limited this amount or just decided not to do it. So my question would be, what kind of policy from Southeast Asian countries do you expect regarding to hotspots and regarding the US-China confrontation in general? Thank you.
Well, we spend far too much time talking about the South China Sea generally, which, as I said to a previous question, is, to my mind, a strategic stalemate. We don't spend enough time discussing what happens on land, and that will include what happens in the Mekong region. Now, I do not know. No, China has plans to build, I think 21 dams or something like that, and maybe 8 or 9 have been already completed in the upper reaches of the Mekong. And there's nothing much anybody can do to that because the upper reaches of the Mekong, the headwaters, are in China, right? Now, I don't know whether the drought was caused by China, whether it was caused deliberately or because of lack of coordination. I don't know, right? But I know those dams are there. right? And I know the Mekong flows through half of ASEAN, 5 of the 10 ASEAN countries. And I know it is a pretty important factor in the economies of those countries. There are ways of dealing with this. It's not a unique problem, you know. In Europe, they have the same problem. And it's not just the Mekong. In fact, all the major Asian rivers, the headwaters are in Chinese territory. Right? And there is a Chinese saying, I'm sure you know it, when you drink water, remember the source. So it is a factor that should be discussed. There are all kinds, I've even forgotten how many, sort of regional organizations dealing with the Mekong. Some are quite old, from the 60s. None of them are very effective. We should think, and this is not something that can be solved only by ASEAN, not something that can be solved only by ASEAN and China. It has to be a much more broader-based effort because, as you know, rivers have a significant influence on microclimates at least. And that has a broader than just regional significance, right? So I don't know what to do about it, but it is a problem. I see there are 3 or 4, I can't remember how many actually, different kinds of sub-regional organizations dealing with the Mekong. Right? None of them seem to be doing very much. So I can identify the problem. I entirely agree with you. It is a problem. I don't see a solution. You can't tell China don't build dams because they will say, this is my territory. Why should I not build dams? Right? Or at the same time, you can't say those dams have absolutely zero impact downstream. How do you manage this? You manage this, and there are rules. I mean, in Europe, you have rivers, major rivers that flow through many countries across national boundaries. You have a very similar problem between Ethiopia and Egypt in the Middle East because of a dam built in Ethiopia, in Ethiopian territory. But it does have an impact on the flow of the Nile. And there are other examples here and there. So it's not a unique problem, but this is something that, in fact, globally, insufficient attention has been paid to, except maybe in Europe. And the European circumstances are quite unique. But I think those, if I'm not mistaken, I may be wrong, some of those rules in Europe were actually developed while the Cold War was on. So if there is the political will, there can be solutions. It's not that politics, strategic competition is an absolute obstacle to this kind of cooperation. It can be done provided people want to be done. But I don't think we even in the Southeast Asian region have had a proper conversation about this, even among ASEAN countries, let alone between ASEAN countries and China. And you can't have just one set of rules for ASEAN and China because, as I said, all the major rivers in Asia originate from the Tibetan Plateau. So you have to have the same rules for India, you have to have the same rules as for ASEAN. You can't say, okay, one set of rules for India, one set of rules for ASEAN. It has to be a broader effort, which has not even begun.
Okay, thank you.
Right.
I'm very optimistic, you can see.
Next question is from Olga Puzanova, who is a researcher at our laboratory and an expert on Japan. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Professor Kausikan. Thank you so much for your time. I very much enjoy your candid manner of speaking and phrases like cultural autism, etc. So now, at the risk of sounding academically myopic, because I studied Japan, I wanted to ask a Japan and COVID question. What is your attitude to Japan? Well, what is its role in the current crisis? Is it viewed as a serious player in the region? I noticed that Japan also opts out for engaging in the whole blame game with the government paying off Japanese companies to shift production out of China and so forth. So I was wondering if you could comment on that. Thank you.
Well, I mentioned there were a number of surveys done by the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies that showed that China and the US were the least trusted major countries in Southeast Asia, by elites at least. Well, those same surveys showed that Japan was the most trusted. I think Japan has played an important role in the economic development of Southeast Asia, which had a strategic impact, although it was not explicitly presented as a strategic initiative. I'm talking about the Fukuda Doctrine, which people don't pay too much attention to these days, but was very important. It was truly visionary, and it did guide Japanese policy for many years. Then Japan fell into a hiatus, essentially because for many years it had no government. 2 or 3 years it had no government, you know. I mean, I used to pride myself on remembering the names of every post-war Japanese prime minister. At some point I gave up because he kept changing it too often, right? But now you have, I think, a fairly stable political situation in Japan. I see no real challenge to the LDP. Mr. Abe may go, but I see no real difference between possible successors' attitude towards Japan playing a more active role in Southeast Asia. I think Japan is already helping countries like Vietnam and Philippines develop maritime surveillance capabilities, their coast guards, and so on. They are doing a number of things along those lines. They are providing alternatives, not in a large scale, to Chinese investment in infrastructure here and there. Right? They have the Quality Infrastructure Initiative, right? Under Abe. And I think these things will outlast Abe. Most important or not of all, I think Japan under Prime Minister Abe in his second term, they are like different people, first term and second term. His second term was the first Asian leader to realize that Mr. Trump's election was a symptom, not a cause. In other words, it signified a different attitude towards America after the end of the Cold War, that there will be a more transactional America. And Mr. Abe, in his second term, began to put into place, very quietly, changes of legislation and administrative rules that will allow the Japan Self-Defense Force to play a different kind of role within the American alliance system, but can do more things. This question of amending the Constitution, to me, is a red herring, and maybe Mr. Abe's personal bee in his bonnet. Because what he wants to change is actually something quite minor, and they can do a lot more now without changing the Constitution. Because they have, you know this thing better than I. The cabinet has reinterpreted the Constitution and so on. And I think this is generally welcomed. I told you the Southeast Asian diplomatic instinct is to hedge, bandwagon, and balance simultaneously. To us, these are not alternatives. You can do all simultaneously. And exploit the natural multipolarity of the region, because if there is more than if there are many poles in the region, if many major powers are engaged in the region, there is more, in principle, more maneuver space for small countries. And Japan is a big part of this equation. I don't think it really matters if Japan is the number 2 economy instead of number 3 economy instead of number 2, or even this is marginal. It may have some passing psychological impact, but I don't think it's such a big deal. Now, I think this is a positive trajectory that Mr. Abe and whoever succeeds him has put Japan on. And I think it's one that we look forward to continuing. But there is no substitute for the US or for China. You need all of them. And I think the Japanese know that too. One factor that we don't talk about, but I did give an interview to Nikkei just after I retired from the foreign ministry for the first time. It was in 2013 or so. it was clear that sooner or later, American extended deterrence would be eroded. Nuclear deterrence I'm talking about. Sooner or later, it's inevitable. And with the North Korean development of nuclear weapons, and however primitive it may be, it is de facto a nuclear weapon state. And I think the Trump administration at least has made it clear that they are most concerned about North Korean ICBMs. They don't really care too much about the medium range and the short range missiles. And that must start people in Northeast Asia, Japan, and South Korea thinking in the same way that Charles de Gaulle thought many decades ago in Europe. Will Tokyo or Seoul, will San Francisco or Los Angeles be sacrificed to save Tokyo or Seoul? The answer is very obvious. It won't. There's already been a fairly open debate in South Korea about whether it should have an independent nuclear deterrent. They even had a debate a few years ago in their National Assembly. In Japan, things are more complicated and more muted. But I find that I go to Japan very often, you know, I mean, before this stupid pandemic shut down all trouble. I used to go to Japan 4 or 5 times a year. I like the place. And I have many friends there. When I first gave this interview that Japan, because of the erosion of extended deterrence, will sooner or later consider having an independent nuclear deterrent, my Japanese friends were shocked. They said, "Why have you become Dr. Strangelove?" I gave exactly the same interview. This was in 2013, now I remember. I gave exactly the same interview in 2018, the end of 2018, to the same Japanese publication. This time, the attitude, the response was quite different. Maybe you have a problem. It's inevitable. Either that or subordination. These are the choice. And I don't think they will subordinate themselves to China, because since the 16th century, when Hideyoshi invaded, unified Japan, what's the first thing he did? He invaded South Korea in defiance of the Chinese world order. And since that time, not being part of the Chinese world order has been an essential part of Japanese national identity. Similar to Korea. Korea is probably the most confusion country, North or South, much more confusion than China. But why are they not Han? Because over many centuries, they refuse to become Han. And these two countries are having, more quietly in Japan and slowly and fairly openly in Korea, a debate about independent nuclear deterrence. And I don't think that is necessarily a bad thing. Why? What is the effect of nuclear weapons? The effect of nuclear weapons is to freeze the status quo. Ever since the Soviet Union developed its own nuclear weapons, there have been no international changes of borders except by internal uprisings only, with one exception, which is the 1967 war in the Middle East. So if there is a multipolar balance of nuclear deterrence in Asia, US, China, Russia, India, Japan, South Korea, North Korea, this will freeze the natural multipolarity of the region. It will prevent the domination of the region by any one power, and it will give more maneuver space to small countries like mine. Now, where we are now and where we will end up is going to be very difficult and very fraught. But I don't think it's not something that can be managed. And I think, anyway, the inherent logic of the situation, Japan will bring it in that direction sooner or later.
Right. Thank you. Now the last question is from Vasily Kashin, who is an expert on China, another one of the best ones. Vasily, Where are you?
Yes, thank you very much.
Hi, how are you?
Yeah, how are you, Bilahari? Yeah,
still
thank
alive,
you very much. Yeah, for excellent presentation. I have a question concerning the situation with food security in Southeast Asia now, because, well, as we know, some countries have forbidden food exports, like Vietnam, and we have mixed signals from China. They spend a lot of effort to convince everyone that they managed to conduct all of the agricultural works in the first quarter in time and have reserves, but they have spikes of panic among the population, and there's fear that they would start buying just everything. Do you see the food security situation in Southeast Asia as tense now, or is it stable? And do all these embargoes on export affect the relationships between the Southeast Asian countries?
Well, I don't really know enough to talk about Southeast Asia as a whole. I can talk about Singapore a bit in some detail, and I can talk about some other Southeast Asian countries in small ways. I simply don't know enough. I'm not avoiding your question. We have taken food security in Singapore very seriously for many decades, for a variety of reasons not related to this pandemic. And we have diversified our sources of essential foodstuffs to, I think, extent that there's no precedent anywhere in the world, for the obvious reason we have actually no agriculture. Now with modern technology, we do have some agriculture, but it will never be enough. So our basic strategy is to diversify. You may be amused to know, I was amused to find out myself some years ago. Do you know who is the biggest supplier of chicken parts to Singapore? Just take a guess. Chicken drumsticks, chicken wings, things like that. Brazil. And that's one example. We have really diversified everything. So it's not that there will be delays if people don't export, and there are delays now because there is a bottleneck in the means of transportation because of the pandemic. But I think we can cope with it. And we have to cope with it because we need to import food. Where can we get it from? In a country like Indonesia, in the worst possible situation, people can go back to their villages and you at least have something to eat. May not be very good, but you have something to eat. Ditto for those big countries in Southeast Asia, like Philippines, like Vietnam, perhaps even Thailand. Myanmar, certainly. Laos, yes. I don't see any tensions because Cambodia, Vietnam, and all that has stopped selling rice to people. I haven't seen any tensions. At least we are not particularly affected by it because we have quite a large stockpile of rice, and you can get rice from other places too. But it's a question of duration. How long will these, all of them are emergency measures, how long will they be in place? And that depends on things we do not know. How long will this pandemic last? When can we start reopening our economies in a serious way? Nobody knows. So it's something to think about. I don't think those countries which have a large agricultural base is going to be a serious problem to the extent that it results in famine or something like that. There will be shortages here and there. There will be moments of panic. Most of the panic for this pandemic, strangely enough, involves toilet paper, which is something I really cannot understand. If it involves rice or something like that, then I can understand. Toilet paper, I don't know why. Even in Singapore, there were some small moments of hysteria over everybody going out to buy toilet paper. Why, I don't know. Oh, okay. But it's a question of duration. If it's only a few months or half a year, I think people will cope. Longer than that, big question marks about whether there will be friction. Right now, I don't see that much friction. People are maybe slightly inconvenienced here and there, but and I don't really see people starving because big agricultural countries, you go back to your village and you know, eat your own produce.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your answers and your talk and your time. It was most interesting. We need some time to think it over. And I hope that while we're thinking and after that, at some point, you'll be able to come to Russia in person and we'll have a discussion. We would also love to go to Singapore because it's
yeah,
nice.
I would love to have you here. But you know, I mean, this thing, the worst thing about this thing is not having to stay at home. I rather enjoy it because I have more time to read. I can still go out and exercise and all that. And I don't get bothered by too many meetings. This kind of meeting, I choose to do it. I want to do it. It's enjoyable. It is interesting. And I thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed your questions. I enjoyed your comments. And I enjoyed seeing many familiar faces, even if it's only electronically. Right. So all of you keep healthy, please. And before too long, we should meet again in person.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Right.
All right. Good night. Good night.